Zora stood behind the counter of her small bakery. She brushed drops of sweat off her forehead, rubbing her hands, tired from a long night's work. She had spent the entire night rolling out dough and baking fresh cakes and pastries for her few but loyal customers. Zora's bakery was known for its cozy atmosphere and the delightful aroma that drifted through the streets when she opened the windows at dawn. However, despite the admiration of her neighbors, her business wasn't bringing in much money. The dream of wealth, of big cities, of a life of luxury, had smoldered in her heart since childhood. She saw it as an escape from the routine, a chance to break free from the tiny village at the foot of the volcano, where everyone knew each other and no one could truly become rich. She longed for recognition, craved for her name to be known far beyond this place. But despite all her dedication, no big changes were happening in her life. Zora had customers, simple village folk, as modest as her earnings. She knew them by name, knew each of their preferences, and felt joy when someone returned for another pastry. But her regular customers could neither bring her the wealth nor the fame she so longed for. One day, in the middle of another quiet morning, a stranger appeared at the bakery's door. He was tall, his face hidden beneath the hood of a dark cloak, and his eyes sparkled like stars in the night sky. He moved silently like a shadow, and his presence seemed to fill the air with tension. There was something strange about him, yet utterly captivating. Zora froze in place as he approached the counter, slowly inspecting her pastries. "How can I help you?" she asked, trying to mask her unease with a polite smile. "Tea and a conversation if you don't mind," he replied, his voice soft but strangely cold. She poured him a cup of freshly brewed tea, and he sat at one of the small tables in the corner of the bakery, watching her every move. A tense silence filled the air as she tried to focus on her tasks, feeling his gaze fixed on her. There was something off about this man, but Zora couldn't quite figure out what it was. After a few minutes of silence, the stranger finally spoke. "I've been watching you for quite some time," he said without lifting his eyes from the cup of tea. "You are talented, and your hands create wonders. But you have one problem. You're too modest for your gift." Zora froze, not expecting such words. This man, who seemed to know more about her than anyone in the village could, spoke mysteriously, and it unsettled her. "Modest?" she asked, trying to grasp what he meant. "Yes, you could be rich and famous. People across the country should know your name. They should line up for your creations. And I can help you with that." His voice was sweet, yet strangely unsettling, like poison dissolved in honey. Zora raised an eyebrow, eyeing the stranger with suspicion. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" she asked, leaning against the counter, arms crossed over her chest. She was curious, but nothing more. From time to time, drifters passed through the village, telling incredible stories and offering miracles. But this man seemed different. He smiled, pulling a small, almost invisible pouch from his cloak. Placing it on the table, he carefully untied the string, revealing a fine gray powder in his palm. A light, almost imperceptible aroma of herbs and spices filled the room. "This is an ancient powder," the stranger began, lifting his hand so Zora could examine the strange ingredient. "A secret of the masters who once ruled at the feasts of great kings. Just the scent of it mesmerizes people, making them obsessed. You'll add it to your dough, and no one will be able to resist your cakes. Everyone will want to come back for more, and fame and fortune will be at your feet." Zora looked at the powder, her heart racing. It sounded too good to be true. Yet at the same time, it made some sense. If she could offer people something special, something magical, her bakery would attract attention. She could finally escape the village, travel, and open shops in the cities. Her gaze shifted from the powder to the stranger. "How much will it cost?" she asked cautiously. She knew that in this world, every service had a price, and sometimes the cost was too high. The stranger smirked. "Just a small favor. When the time comes, I'll come for my payment. But don't worry, for such a talented woman as you, it will be a trifle." His smile widened, and his eyes gleamed like those of a predator. Zora paused for a moment, contemplating his offer. She sensed that something was off about this man, but greed and the desire for fame clouded her judgment. After all, this was her chance for success, for wealth, for the life she had always dreamed of. What could this small favor possibly entail? "All right," she said, reaching for the pouch. "I agree." The stranger stood up and handed her the pouch of powder, his smile now appearing even more sinister. When his fingers brushed against her hand, Zora felt a chill, as if an icy wind had passed through her. "Good luck, Zora. I believe you won't disappoint," he said before disappearing through the bakery door, leaving behind only a trail of cool air and a strange scent. Zora stood still for a few minutes, staring at the pouch of powder in her hands. Inside her, a mix of emotions swirled, fear and excitement at the same time. But the thirst for success overshadowed everything else. That night, as the village slept, she lit the oven and began preparing a new cake. At the last moment, just before sending the dough into the oven, she added a pinch of the grayish powder. Suddenly, an unfamiliar sweet aroma filled the air, seeming to seep into every crack of her home. The next morning, Zora couldn't even begin to imagine where her decision would lead her. The morning began as usual. The sun slowly rose above the horizon, painting the village streets in shades of pink and gold. But this time, everything was different. Even before Zora opened her bakery, a small crowd had gathered at the doorstep. People were excitedly murmuring, their faces reflecting an anticipation bordering on obsession. Zora nervously glanced at her first customers, for in all her time working, she had never experienced such a frenzy. When she opened the door, she was instantly surrounded. People were asking for just one thing: that cake. Zora looked around in surprise at the display case, where the cake she had prepared the night before with the added powder sat enticingly. Its sweet aroma filled the room, and the crowd stirred even more, like hungry wolves sensing their prey. She cut the first piece and handed it to a woman in a blue scarf, an old acquaintance who always ordered the same pastry. But today she didn't even glance at her usual treat. Her eyes were solely fixed on the cake. "You'll love it," Zora said, trying to hold back her excitement. Yet something about the situation unsettled her. When the woman took her first bite, her face lit up. Her eyes widened as if she were experiencing unparalleled delight. Moments later, she devoured the second and third pieces, oblivious to the crumbs spreading across her lips. Seeing her reaction, the others began to crowd around, offering money and pleading for their own portion. By noon, the cake was completely sold out, and Zora, overwhelmed by the demand, could barely keep up with the orders for the next day. She couldn't believe that just one cake had attracted so much attention. Yet inside her, anxiety was growing. Something felt off. The customers weren't just enjoying her sweets. They were obsessed with them. Their eyes conveyed something deeper than mere pleasure. One person stood out in the crowd, Lucia, the local drunkard and layabout. His notorious reputation spread far beyond the village. He was known for his vices, an insatiable thirst for drink, a disheveled appearance, and a tendency to boast. Lucia could often be seen sitting at the door of the local tavern, sipping on the local palm wine and spinning tales of his heroic deeds. Yet, despite his flaws, he possessed an indescribable charm that drew people to him. Even those who condemned his lifestyle couldn't help but laugh at his jokes and stories. Zora had known Lucia since childhood. He was her neighbor, and she always felt a mix of pity and irritation towards him. Sometimes he would come into her bakery to ask for something sweet on credit, and Zora, though grumbling, could never refuse him. But today, he looked different. His eyes burned with greed, and he could hardly stay still, waiting for his portion. "Hey, Zora," he called out, propping himself up from his spot against the bakery wall. "I heard you have a new cake. Will there be a piece for me?" Her gaze met his laughing eyes, and despite his reputation, she couldn't help but smile in return. "Lucia, if I had known you were coming, I would have saved you a piece. But it's all sold out." "Oh, come on, Zora. You know you can't refuse me," he said, leaning in a bit closer. "Maybe you could make an exception for an old friend, just one tiny piece. I'm not like those crazies." Zora sighed. Lucia was a master manipulator. His charm and carefree attitude had an effect on her, despite her conscious attempt to resist. She knew she shouldn't give in, but something inside her urged her to make a concession. She pulled out a small piece she had hidden under the table for herself and handed it to Lucia. His eyes sparkled like a child who had just been given a candy. "Thank you, Zora. You're an angel," he said, quickly taking a bite. But barely swallowing the first piece, he froze. His smile vanished, and something strange reflected on his face. It was as if he had become immobilized, staring into emptiness. "Lucia, are you all right?" she asked, but he didn't respond. Suddenly, without warning, he snatched the remaining piece and greedily shoved it into his mouth, as if he couldn't get enough. His movements were quick and jerky, as if he were fighting against some invisible force. "Lucia," she exclaimed, trying to grab the remnants from him. "What's wrong with you?" He looked at her with a strange glint in his eyes, and his face twisted, as if he had lost control. This was not just satisfaction from food. It was something else. Obsession. "This is incredible," he whispered, wiping his mouth. "I've never tasted anything like this." He started laughing, his laughter loud and sharp, echoing through the bakery and causing Zora to flinch. But there was something frightening in his laughter, as if he himself didn't understand why he was laughing. Zora watched him in horror. She sensed that there was something more to this cake than just its taste. With each passing minute, her fear grew. Soon, Lucia, as if forgetting his state, swayed and headed for the door. "Thanks, Zora," he called over his shoulder, not looking back. No sooner had he stepped outside than a new crowd of people appeared at the doorstep, already having heard about the unusual cake. They came with a clear purpose, to taste this wonder. Zora realized that her bakery had become the center of attention. But this attention did not bring her joy. The smiles and gratitude of her customers seemed increasingly strange and frightening to her. People no longer simply delighted in her baked goods. They craved them, like addicts yearning for their next fix. Another week passed, and her business continued to grow. She was earning money she had never dreamed of. But with each cake sold, a growing sense of unease filled her soul. Every day, Lucia returned for another portion, and each time he looked worse. His face became more gaunt, and his eyes sank deeper into their sockets. Yet he continued to smile, as if this decline brought him no distress. "Zora, you've done the impossible," he would say when he came for his next cake. "This is the best thing I've ever tasted, but I feel like I need more and more to feel that same high." Her heart tightened every time she saw him. Lucia was perhaps the only person in the village with whom she could speak openly, despite his flaws. But now even he was turning into someone else, as if some unknown evil was claiming him. Several weeks had passed since Zora began adding the mysterious powder to her sweets. Her bakery had become the center of the entire village. People stood in long lines from dawn to dusk, willing to spend their last coins for a piece of pastry or cake. At first glance, everything seemed perfect. Zora had become wealthy, and her life appeared to have transformed into a fairy tale. But deep inside her, a feeling was growing that it wouldn't last long. The village began to change. People became increasingly obsessed with her baked goods. The joy and carefreeness of the past had vanished, replaced by constant anxiety and an insatiable craving. Even the children, who once delighted in their favorite pastries, now demanded more and more, while their parents, exhausted from endless requests, started to exhibit aggressive insistence. The villagers forgot about their responsibilities, fields, and crafts. All their time was devoted solely to one thing: finding money to return for new portions. But perhaps the most alarming change for Zora was in how Lucia had transformed. Once a charming, cheerful, albeit aimless drunkard, Lucia now looked like a pale shadow of his former self. His face had become gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his skin had turned pale. He came to the bakery every day, no longer joking or smiling, but merely whispering for more and more cakes. There was no trace left of his previous liveliness. "Zora," he whispered one day, sitting at the counter, "I can't go on without your cakes. You have to give me more." Zora noticed his hands trembling, as if he were on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She could barely recognize in him the Lucia who had once been the life of the party, telling tales at the tavern door. Now he resembled someone possessed. Yet she couldn't shake a strange feeling of pity and guilt. Something in her heart told her that she was the cause of his downfall. "Lucia, you need to stop," she tried to tell him, reaching out her hand. But Lucia only smirked, and his smile was chillingly painful. "No, Zora, you're the one who made us this way." And now, he leaned closer, his eyes almost wild. "You're in this too, you can feel it, can't you?" Zora recoiled, unwilling to hear those words. She wanted to return to her work, to hide from this reality. But more and more she found herself confronted with a reality that was becoming increasingly sinister. Not just Lucia, all her clients, even the most loyal ones, began to change. Their gazes grew vacant, like those of people who had lost touch with themselves. Yet, she continued to work, unable to stop. One night, as Zora sat by the fireplace in her large new home, the doors swung open abruptly. There stood the very stranger who had once offered her the powder. His eyes sparkled in the dim light, and his face was illuminated by a strange glow. "It's time, Zora," he said with a cold smile. "Time for what?" she asked fearfully, feeling a chill grip her heart. "For my payment, of course. You didn't think this was all for free, did you?" He stepped forward, his voice like the whisper of wind seeping through the windows. "You've gained wealth, fame, but now it's time to pay the piper." Zora froze. She knew there was a catch, but she couldn't believe this was happening for real. Fear pierced her. She took a step back. "What do you want?" she whispered, gripping the back of a chair. "I want your heart, Zora." "Not physically, of course," he smirked, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "I want your desire for life, your soul. You've created something great, but like all great things, it demands sacrifices." Zora felt her legs weaken. She realized that everything she had created was a curse. The people she loved, her clients, her friends, had all suffered because of her greed. Even Lucia, despite all his flaws, had become a victim of her reckless decisions. She had been consumed by the idea of becoming rich, and now she was paying the price for it. Zora understood that she had a choice. Either she would give her soul to the stranger, or she would try to change the situation. She remembered Lucia and his words. "You're involved in this too." She was guilty of allowing evil to spread through her baking. "No," she shouted, rising to her feet. "I will no longer be your puppet." The stranger smirked, but his eyes darkened. He reached out his hand, and Zora felt her strength fading, as if her life was slipping away. But at that moment, the door burst open with a crash, and Lucia staggered into the bakery, breathing heavily. "Don't touch her," he shouted, his voice filled with both pain and determination. The stranger frowned, clearly not expecting such a turn of events. "You?" he hissed, looking at Lucia as if he were an annoying fly. "You're insignificant. You're part of this plan." Lucia staggered closer to Zora and looked her in the eyes. His face was twisted with suffering, but there was a strange strength in his gaze. "Zora," he whispered, "I know you can fix this. It's not entirely your fault, but if you don't stop him, he will destroy us all." Tears welled up in Zora's eyes. She knew Lucia was right. She could no longer allow greed to control her life. Gathering all her strength, Zora turned to the stranger. "I refuse your gift," she shouted. "Take your powder and leave us alone." The stranger snarled, his face beginning to contort into something inhuman. But suddenly, the room filled with light. The powder that Zora held started to glow in her hands. The stranger howled in pain as his form began to dissolve into the air, as if he were nothing more than a shadow. As he vanished, Zora and Lucia collapsed to the floor, exhausted and drained. Silence fell over the bakery once more. The aroma of the cakes no longer felt sweet, it only evoked bitterness. Several days passed. The villagers began to regain their senses, as if waking from a long nightmare. Zora closed the bakery and didn't venture outside for a while. Her life returned to simplicity. But now she understood that true happiness wasn't found in wealth or fame. The moral of this story is simple. Greed and the desire for instant success can lead to destruction. Sometimes what appears to be a quick path to happiness hides dark consequences. People should value what they have and be cautious with desires that may lead to their downfall. In the end, Zora realized that the wealth of the soul is far more important than material riches. May your life be full of joy and limitless possibilities. Thanks for watching. Be sure to share your opinion and don't forget to write a comment. Subscribe to my channel. See you in the next video.